Hello, everyone, and welcome to the In Their Own Words podcast. My name is Danny. Today, we're going to start our series of podcasts with the Victorians. For those who are wondering what the In Their Own Words podcast is and may have missed our introductory episode, I'm essentially going to be taking you back through different eras in history to hear from those who actually lived that history. Throughout the podcast, which I hope to carry on for a significant amount of time, we're going to look at various people groups and different eras in history. This will include the Victorians, of course, who we're starting with, as well as the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, voices from the First and Second World War, the Tudors, the Renaissance, and the list goes on. Essentially, I want this series of podcasts to provide you with a snapshot of what life was like during a certain time frame or for a certain people group. This means we won't look at everything when it comes to history, but we'll look at certain segments, which might include certain occupations or certain people who were important to that time frame. So with all that being said, and me having made my second pitch for why you should listen to this show, let's get into our very first episode, our introductory episode into the Victorians. The era following the Georgian era and preceding the Edwardian era in British history is that of the Victorians. Characterized and named for the reign of Queen Victoria, this era is traditionally defined as having started in 1837 when Victoria ascended to the throne and ending with her death in 1901. The Victorian period was an incredible time of innovation. It was the era when Britannia truly ruled the waves. Following Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the British Empire would become the sole world power for the next 100 years, conquering everywhere it went in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. Michael Patterson writes that Britain at the start of Victoria's reign seemed a nation poised for revolution, but by the end of it had been transformed into a country full of hope and confidence at the helm of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Now, it's important to note that Victorian England was fundamentally divided by class, so the experiences of the people who lived during this time were incredibly varied. But in this podcast, we'll be hearing from the Victorians themselves and have the chance to hear from those of every walk of life who had their own part to play in this period in history. And we'll be listening to them tell their stories in their words. The Victorians were a tremendously optimistic bunch for the most part, as the world, which had started out so big and strange and mystical at the start of the 19th century, became smaller, more recognizable, and much more scientific by the end. The Victorians have also left us with so much. Traditions, for example, which we still cling to today, like Christmas trees and caroling and gift-giving at Christmas time, were first started by the Victorians. Great names from history, instantly recognizable, like Charles Darwin, Florence Nightingale, and Charles Dickens, were Victorians. Even Sherlock Holmes, fictional though he may be, was a Victorian, and his captivating mysteries, which have delighted readers and audiences for decades, are a product of this era. Other mainstays of our modern era like tea, newspapers, coffee shops, railways, football, tennis, fish and chips, and even keyboards, derived of course from typewriters, are all products of this fascinating time when the quality of life for so many was drastically improved by new inventions. We have the Victorians to thank for our mailing system, our underground and subway stations, suspension bridges, internal combustion engines, and so much more. Of course, so much could never have been accomplished without the help of cheap labor in the form of underpaid men, women, and children. The squalor in which some Victorians lived would eventually become a major concern of the upper classes in later decades. Orphanages and workhouses sprang up across Britain and the Empire in an attempt to help those upon whom life's toughest circumstances had taken its toll. That being said, the Victorian era laid the foundations for equality for all in the 20th century. Slavery was abolished during the Victorian era, labor conditions were improved, voting rights were extended to new people, and for the first time the working classes were being introduced to leisure activities. The Victorian age was a time of enlightenment, religious fervor, ingenuity, and social change. It allowed for the flourishing of music, architecture, and art, and facilitated the completion of Western expansion. So much of what we take for granted today, we owe to the Victorians. And that's why I think it's only fair we hear their stories and become acquainted with these people, who were very much as real, personable, and human as you and I. Instead of reading off facts and dates, we're going to catch a glimpse of the lives of those who lived through this time and who, by their life, made the Victorian era what it was. We'll get to hear their thoughts, their dreams, their fears, their loves and loss, and learn what it was really like to be a Victorian at the best and worst of times. Join me as we embark on this historic journey for the Victorians, in their own words.